The air smelled different the morning Willow Harper stepped into the backyard with her mug of black coffee. Not because anything had changed in the soil, or in the wind, or even in the light that poured over the pine border, but because she had that subtle, unshakable instinct that something was off. It wasn't the kind of thing you could measure or photograph. It was a shift in atmosphere. The invisible tension that settled in after weeks of silence suddenly gave way to the presence of something misplaced, something that didn't belong. She stood still for a few moments, blinking at the far end of the yard, at the neat line of decorative stones they'd placed along what had always been the back boundary. The stones weren't grand or formal. They were functional, carefully arranged by her husband Matt with a trowel, a tape measure, and stubborn exactness, because he believed that if you were going to set limits, you should make sure they held. That line had been there for months now, ever since they moved in at the start of spring. The Harpers weren't newcomers to this kind of work. They'd spent most of their married life running a small restoration business in urban neighborhoods, refitting old homes with updated fixtures, rebuilding sheds and greenhouses, helping with odd carpentry jobs. But this time, they wanted something. Quieter, slower, and more long-term. When they found the listing for a leasehold property at the edge of a quiet, rural town with a long rectangular lot and a single-story brick house that had belonged to the same family for 2 generations, it felt like the kind of place where they could settle, work with their hands, and finally build something for themselves. The lease was generous, 30 years with the option to buy, and the land was clearly demarcated on the documents. 1.2 acres, fenced along 3 sides, and open along the east boundary, which the listing explicitly marked with 2 stone markers dated back to the 1960s. The eastern line backed onto a neighboring lot with a slightly elevated house surrounded by wind chimes and ceramic garden animals. It was tidy in a curated, artificial way. That was Karen's house. Karen introduced herself on their 3rd day in the neighborhood with a wicker basket of scones, a laminated card detailing her homemade elderflower syrup, and a warm, rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She talked quickly, praised the Harpers' decision to move somewhere sane, and lamented the rise of loud city people and their bad taste in fences. She pointed out, almost offhandedly, that the boundary line had always been a little fuzzy near the stone markers, and that her late husband had always said the original surveyor was a drunk. Matt nodded politely, and Willow took the scones, but neither of them was particularly convinced by her charm. Karen had the kind of energy that seemed to require an audience, not a conversation. She liked control, and the Harpers knew enough to recognize the type. The first 2 months passed without incident. Willow built raised beds for their herbs and cut flowers while Matt focused on converting the garage into a studio for his custom woodworking. They ordered soil, installed irrigation, and met a few neighbors while walking their dog in the evenings. Life didn't feel settled exactly, but it was moving toward something like peace. That feeling broke the morning Willow noticed the shift in the stones. She set her coffee down and walked the yard slowly, glancing back toward the patio and then forward again, as if confirming she wasn't imagining things. The stone marker closest to the southeast corner was off. It was slight, just a few inches, but that was all it took to destabilize everything. Willow called for Matt, who joined her barefoot and confused, rubbing his temples. He didn't speak at first, just squinted at the stone, walked 20 feet back to check the next marker, then returned. "No way this happened on its own," he muttered. "No slope, no animal, no storm. Someone moved it." They checked the survey map again that afternoon. The documents were clear. The stones were in place when the lease was signed, and their placement matched the coordinates recorded on the municipal records. There had been no alterations filed, no permit requests submitted, nothing to suggest the boundary had changed. Willow took pictures, documented the alignment using a level and tape, and sent a calm, non-accusatory email to the property manager asking whether any maintenance or boundary work had been done recently. The manager replied the next day. No, nothing had been done. If something looked out of place, they were free to document it and submit a note for the file. Later that week, Willow returned from town with supplies and saw something that stopped her cold. Karen had installed a new decorative bench and 2 large ceramic planters in the area just beyond the shifted stone. Not on her own side, but on what used to be the Harpers' eastern edge, now subtly overtaken by a few feet. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't accidental either. Willow stood near her car, watching as Karen pruned a bonsai tree on her porch, sunglasses hiding her expression. Karen raised a hand in a half-wave, smiled, and shouted across the space, "I thought that area was going to waste. Just wanted to dress it up a bit. Hope you don't mind." Matt, who had been inside cleaning tools, came out just in time to hear the last part. He didn't wave. Willow simply replied, "We'll let you know," and walked inside without further conversation. That night, they sat at the table with the map again, marking exact measurements, and decided not to confront Karen directly. Not yet. But the tone had changed. The land didn't feel theirs in the way it used to. There was an encroachment now, even if it was subtle. And once someone takes a step over a line, unchallenged, it becomes easier to take another. Over the next week, a slow, calculated series of small additions appeared on the disputed strip. A folding chair, wind spinners, a bird bath. Each was placed casually, as if without thought, and yet always aligned with that subtly adjusted boundary. Matt caught Karen one morning walking a tape measure along her own flower bed, muttering to herself. When she noticed him, she simply smiled and said, "Just making sure I've got enough space for a compost barrel." You know how things creep over time. They knew, and they were done pretending otherwise. That evening, after dark, Matt pulled out the contract again and started making a list. The Harpers weren't impulsive. They weren't paranoid. But they were methodical, and they understood that the worst kind of theft didn't happen with trucks or locks. It happened quietly, with one foot placed over a line that wasn't defended. What they didn't know then, and what would only become clear in the weeks that followed, was just how far Karen was willing to go to take what she believed was hers, and what it would take for them to stop her. Not with threats, not with lawsuits, but with something as solid and final as a wall, and the sound it made when it split through the side of a bedroom that had no right to be there in the first place. The sound of children's voices was the first clue that something had shifted again. It was a Saturday morning, and Willow had just stepped outside with a canvas tote full of seed packets when she heard the sharp ring of laughter coming from the east side of the yard. It wasn't the sound itself that bothered her. She had nothing against kids playing, but it was the location. As she walked toward the greenhouse, her eyes settled on the far edge of the property, and there they were. 2 young boys, no older than 8 or 9, digging into the ground near the disputed stone marker with small plastic shovels. Behind them, perched like a matriarchal figure presiding over her kingdom, Karen sat on a folding lounger with a wide-brimmed sun hat and a chilled glass of something citrus-colored. Willow stood still for a moment, trying to assess whether this was another casual placement or something more deliberate. Karen looked up, met her eyes, and raised her glass slightly. Willow didn't wave. She didn't move at all, and when Karen returned her gaze to the boys, Willow turned and went inside. By that point, it had been 3 weeks since they'd first noticed the boundary marker had been moved. In that time, Matt had logged and printed every official document they had related to the lease, the survey, and the property's mapped limits. They'd contacted the land office again and submitted a formal boundary inquiry. Not a complaint, not yet, but a request to have a municipal review done. The process wasn't fast. The clerk had told them there was a backlog, and since this was a civil matter, not a criminal one, it could take several more weeks. In the meantime, the Harpers were left to manage a situation that was slipping further into uncomfortable territory. The next incident came on a Tuesday. Matt was cutting cedar panels in the backyard for a trellis when he heard the sound of something scraping along the fence post near the back corner. When he came around, he found a man, tall, with a clipboard, measuring from the edge of Karen's patio to the disputed zone. Matt watched him work in silence for a moment before stepping closer and asking who he was. The man, unbothered, introduced himself as a property assessor hired by Karen, just to double-check old data before a planned remodel. She said the lot lines have always been a little messy, he added. Honestly, it's not unusual for boundary drift over time, especially in areas without modern pins. Matt, keeping his tone calm, replied that their markers had been confirmed by municipal documents less than a year ago, that no legal adjustment had been filed and that any remodel requiring space on that strip would likely need a hearing. The man shrugged, scribbled something, and said, "Well, I just measure what I'm paid to measure." That evening, Willow suggested that they start documenting everything more aggressively. It wasn't enough to have contracts and surveys. They needed records, timestamps, photos, anything that established how the space had changed over time. Not because they wanted to build a case, but because the line between suggestion and action had been crossed again and again. They weren't looking for a fight, but they could no longer pretend they weren't in one. The tone shifted further when they received a letter, an actual envelope, sealed and delivered to their door. Inside was a printed complaint, unofficial but formal in tone, written on standard printer paper with Karen's name signed at the bottom. It stated that the Harpers had intruded repeatedly on her property, particularly by maintaining unauthorized plantings and structures on what she claimed to be an extension of her own lot. She referenced the historical understanding that the property line had always been closer to the Harpers' greenhouse and cited anecdotal testimony from previous neighbors, none of whom still lived on the street. There was no legal basis for any of it, but the letter's tone was clinical, unyielding, and vaguely threatening. It ended with a demand. Remove all materials and planters within 5 feet of the disputed line, or she would pursue formal rectification through the appropriate civil channels. Matt read the letter twice and folded it neatly before setting it on the table. "So she's done playing," he said. Willow didn't answer. She was already flipping through the lease agreement again, checking for wording about usage, boundary enforcement, dispute processes. That night they drafted their own letter, measured, precise, without emotion, restating the legal boundary as defined in their contract and informing Karen that no further claims would be acknowledged without court action. They hand-delivered it the next morning, sliding it into her mailbox without comment. For a few days, things seemed to settle. The boys didn't return. Karen didn't appear in the yard. There were no new planters, no new furniture encroaching onto the space. Willow allowed herself to believe, briefly, that perhaps the standoff had ended, that Karen had gotten her bluff out of her system. But she was wrong. The breaking point came just before dusk one Wednesday, when Matt was unloading timber for a small pergola they were building near the eastern fence. As he backed the truck in and began stacking the wood, he noticed a thin metal post embedded in the ground 3 feet deeper into their side of the yard than the original stone marker. Attached to the post was a piece of red tape, flapping gently in the breeze. It looked like a surveyor's flag, something you'd see on a construction site. But there had been no survey, no permission, no notice. Matt followed the line of sight and realized there were 3 more flags, placed at exact intervals, forming a new artificial border that stole a 6-foot-wide strip along the entire length of their property. It ran cleanly from one end to the other, like a blade through the earth, redefining ownership without consent. As he stood there, one hand still resting on a beam of timber, he saw Karen watching from her porch with a cup of tea in hand. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just raised her cup slightly, as if in recognition of a well-played move. Willow didn't panic when Matt told her. She didn't shout or weep. She walked outside, traced the flags, took her own photos, then walked back in and made a call to their lawyer. Not a friend, not a neighbor, but a professional they had hired months earlier when drafting business contracts for their workshop. She asked for a consultation on a boundary encroachment dispute and requested guidance on how to formally block further alteration attempts. The lawyer scheduled them in for the next day and advised them not to touch the flags in the meantime. But the flags weren't the last step. That same evening, under cover of dusk, a set of solar lights were installed just behind the flags, 4-foot spikes with dim LEDs, glowing faintly in the soil that did not belong to Karen. They were designed to look tasteful, subtle, almost invisible in daylight, but at night they glowed with eerie precision, outlining a false border, an unspoken declaration of conquest. Matt didn't sleep that night. He sat near the back door for hours, watching the lights pulse, hearing the wind twist in the hedges. Willow came down at 2 a.m., made tea, and sat beside him in silence. They didn't need to speak to know what came next. This was no longer miscommunication, no misunderstanding. It was a slow, calculated erosion of property, of privacy, of control, executed in inches and disguised as civility. Karen was no longer inching. She was claiming. And the Harpers knew that if they didn't act decisively, the next move wouldn't be flags or letters. It would be concrete. This wasn't about one neighbor anymore. It was about a boundary being erased, and what people were willing to do when they believed no one would stop them. It began with the sound of digging. Not loud, not frenzied, just that slow, steady rhythm of steel breaking earth, of someone reshaping the ground with deliberate purpose. Willow heard it first from the upstairs window as she sorted seed catalogs by bloom cycles, thinking she had at least a week before the tulips demanded resoiling. The noise came from the eastern boundary, too consistent to be wind and too rhythmic to be the harmless play of an animal. She stepped onto the balcony, the thin slats groaning under her weight, and looked toward the far end of the lot. That's when she saw the trench. Karen had hired 2 men, both in their early 40s, dressed in municipal orange, and they were methodically cutting into the soil, not along the original fence line, but along the path where the red flags and solar lights had been planted a few days prior. The lights were gone now, removed, and in their place was a narrow trench about 18 inches deep and wide enough to hold posts. Fence posts. Willow didn't move. She didn't shout. She simply watched until one of the men noticed her, gave a small nod, and returned to work without saying a word. She turned back inside, called Matt, and said 6 words that froze his breath. "She's putting in a new fence." By the time Matt returned from the hardware store 20 minutes later, the trench extended halfway across their yard. The men were quick and efficient, using tools Matt recognized as rentals from a nearby equipment depot, which meant Karen hadn't planned this days in advance. She had acted fast, almost recklessly, once the Harpers had failed to respond to her flags. And letters with submission. Matt didn't confront the workers. He took photos, time-stamped the progress, and walked the perimeter with a clipboard, documenting the trench's trajectory versus the legal boundary shown in their contract and the municipal plat map. When he was done, he walked up to Karen's porch. She didn't greet him. She simply stood with one hand on her hip and said, "They'll be done by dusk. Best if you keep your dog inside." Matt didn't respond to the jab. He asked if she had a permit for the fencing work, since the trench clearly crossed the recorded boundary of their leasehold. Karen smiled without teeth. "The real line's been debated for years, Matthew. I'm just restoring what was always mine." He told her calmly that she was trespassing, that her workers were modifying private land, and that unless they halted immediately, he would be forced to file a civil action. Her only reply was a shrug. "Then do it," she said. "But this time, bring a surveyor who knows what the hell he's doing." That night, Matt and Willow didn't speak over dinner. The plates sat between them like props, and the hum of the fridge became louder than anything either of them could say. Afterward, Matt spent 2 hours gathering documents. He emailed their lawyer everything: photographs, measurements, video clips, excerpts from the lease, timestamps, and 2 annotated maps. He titled the email, Boundary interference. Immediate action requested. The lawyer replied at 11:13 p.m., confirming receipt and stating he would file a cease and desist letter first thing in the morning, followed by an emergency motion for injunction against any structural encroachment. He also warned them not to confront the workers directly, no matter how tempting, and not to remove the trench or materials without legal grounds, as Karen could later claim vandalism or harassment. The next morning, they awoke to find fence posts already installed. Tall, pressure-treated wood, sunk deep into concrete with crossbeams already fastened. It ran 30 feet across their lot and blocked access to one of Willow's tool sheds. Matt couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about a few inches of soil anymore. It was the deliberate seizure of usable land. The fence sliced through their eastern quarter like a spine, imposing and final. Karen was escalating, and she wasn't alone. 2 more workers had arrived that morning, and a pallet of pre-cut cedar planks now sat in Karen's driveway covered in tarp. She wasn't just rebuilding an old fence. She was fortifying a new border. Willow went to the municipal office that day. She didn't yell or flinch. She stood in line behind a teenager applying for a dog license and a man paying a parking fine. When her turn came, she requested a copy of the neighborhood's construction permits and asked, plainly, if any had been filed by Karen Whitmore for a residential fence installation within the past month. The clerk checked the system. There were none. Willow then asked whether emergency construction over disputed land could be halted pending injunction. The clerk said it depended on the zoning officer. She filled out the form. She took a copy with her. Then she walked out, not with anger, but with the same chill precision Karen had shown the week before. Later that afternoon, their lawyer emailed a scanned version of the cease and desist letter that had been physically delivered to Karen's address. It was worded formally, outlining the legal boundary, referencing the lease, identifying the trench as a physical violation of property, and demanding immediate cessation of all work. It also mentioned that any further attempts to restrict access to areas under lease by the Harpers would constitute grounds for damages. Karen, as expected, ignored it. The next morning, the cedar boards were nailed in place. The fence was completed. 8 feet tall. No gate. The effect was instantaneous. The eastern third of their yard was now inaccessible without hopping the fence or walking around the block through Karen's driveway. The tool shed remained on their side, but the entrance was blocked by the fence. Matt called the zoning office. No one picked up. He left a voicemail and filed a second notice online. The lawyer began drafting the emergency motion, but warned that it could take a week before a hearing would be granted. "We're in limbo," Matt said that evening. Willow, leaning on the kitchen counter, replied without looking up, "Not for long." 2 nights later, they heard footsteps. Not the chaotic shuffle of animals or the deep thump of human boots, but soft, deliberate pacing. Willow turned off the porch light and waited. Through the blinds, she saw Karen walking the fence line from the other side, flashlight in hand, inspecting the panels, occasionally pausing to nudge a board or test a post. She was checking her work, checking her hold. Willow didn't move. She didn't film. She didn't speak. She just watched. And then, in a moment so subtle it felt dreamlike, Karen turned and looked directly at their window. Not by accident, not by coincidence. It was a stare, silent and exact. Then she turned off the flashlight and walked away. That was the moment the Harpers stopped calling it a dispute. It was an occupation now, and they were behind enemy lines. The call came at 2:17 p.m., precisely 7 minutes after Willow had submitted the second affidavit to their lawyer. It was from the municipal zoning office, and the voice on the other end was dry and vaguely disinterested. The man identified himself as Gerald from Code Enforcement, said he had received both the Harpers' complaint and the lawyer's petition, and that he happened to be in the area. He offered to stop by for a quick on-site evaluation. Willow agreed immediately. Matt was still out gathering supplies for a workshop order, so she waited alone, arms crossed, staring out the kitchen window at the solid stretch of cedar slicing across their property like a monument to someone else's authority. It no longer felt like a fence. It felt like a wall, not just of wood, but of assumption, entitlement, and unspoken rules that someone else had decided they were too passive to challenge. She was still standing there when Gerald arrived. He was older than she expected, with thinning gray hair, a tan windbreaker, and a clipboard he held like a weapon of bureaucracy. He asked to see the original survey documents and the lease plat, which Willow had laid out in triplicate on the kitchen counter. He examined them silently, tracing a weathered finger along the lines, nodding every so often but offering no commentary. Then they walked outside. He asked no permission before stepping through the side gate and into the yard, moving with the practiced, quiet gait of someone used to walking other people's borders. When he reached the new fence, he crouched, studied the trenching, then looked back at the tool shed's blocked entrance. He took a photo. Then he walked the length of the fence to the far end, where Karen's planters and patio furniture stood smugly in a row. Without a word, he stepped up onto her side, knocked on her porch railing, and waited. Karen came out slowly, a picture of rehearsed concern, with her reading glasses hanging around her neck and a folded magazine in her hand. She greeted Gerald like an old friend, not with familiarity, but with assumption. She called him Mr. Adams, offered iced tea, and launched into a well-practiced narrative about how the Harpers had misunderstood the historic property lines, how her late husband had always maintained that the eastern lot line was misrecorded, and how she was just trying to preserve neighborhood harmony by maintaining what she insisted was a pre-existing shared boundary. She never raised her voice. She smiled between sentences. She never once said fence. She said boundary reinforcement. Gerald listened without blinking, then asked, "Do you have your own survey on file?" Karen said she did, but that it was informal. She offered to fetch it. He said he'd wait. What she brought out was laughable. A photocopy of a decades-old sketch, hand-drawn, with no official stamps or coordinates, and a note in the corner that read, "Approximate layout." Gerald didn't comment. He took it, glanced at it, folded it into his clipboard, and turned to walk back across the line. Karen called out after him, "I hope this can be resolved peacefully, Mr. Adams." He didn't respond. He simply walked back to Willow, who had watched the whole interaction from the edge of her steps with arms crossed and breath held tight in her lungs. Gerald paused in front of her, then finally spoke. "You're not crazy," he said plainly. "The line's off by at least 5 feet in your favor, possibly more, and she's built right over it." Willow didn't smile. She just nodded. He continued, "I'm going to file a notice of zoning violation. That'll freeze any further construction or modification. But don't expect her to comply without being forced. She's the kind that sees process as permission." Willow asked what happened next. Gerald rubbed the back of his neck. "Your lawyer's going to need to push for a structural removal order. That takes time. Meanwhile, I'm putting it on record that what she's built is unpermitted and encroaching." He handed Willow a carbon copy of the notice he'd filled out on his clipboard. "You'll want this for court." That night, for the first time in weeks, Willow allowed herself a single breath of vindication. Not relief, not yet, but validation. She wasn't imagining things. They weren't overreacting. And Karen was not operating in a gray area anymore. She was standing squarely on the wrong side of the law, though it remained to be seen whether she would care. Matt returned home, read the violation form, and said only one word: "Finally." But vindication wasn't victory. 2 days later, Karen erected a decorative trellis on her side of the new fence, directly opposite the blocked tool shed. It held artificial ivy and 3 brass hooks, from which now hung wind chimes that rang discordantly in even the slightest breeze. On one hook was a laminated sign that read, "Private Area. Respect the boundary." Matt saw it first and nearly crushed the watering can he was holding. Willow said nothing. She just stared at the sign for a full minute, then walked inside, retrieved her phone, and called the lawyer again. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen escalation before, clients who won a point and then watched their neighbors retaliate in petty, precise ways that were designed to provoke without violating the letter of any ordinance. "That's not offense expansion," the lawyer said. "It's not structural, it's symbolic, but keep documenting it. It's part of a pattern." He was preparing their petition for a hearing. It would be filed Monday. He warned again. "She's playing for time." You play for evidence. The weekend passed with more quiet moves. A motion light was installed on Karen's garage, positioned to cast a cone of brightness directly across the fence into the Harpers' yard. When Matt tried to adjust their own backlight to counter it, the system overloaded. A power surge, minor but enough to remind them that nothing on their side of the yard was untouched anymore. That same night, someone dumped a bag of clippings over their compost bin. Foreign thorned brush that didn't match anything in their own yard. Willow bagged it and set it aside. No accusation. Just another line on the list. By Monday morning, the motion for removal had been filed. Their lawyer had included the plat maps, the photographs, the zoning violation, the measurements, and even the laminated sign. It was thorough, deliberate, and precise. But it would take time to reach court. Days, maybe weeks. The lawyer said they had done everything right. Now it was up to the system, and the Harpers understood what that meant. Karen had built a wall. Now they would have to decide what they were willing to build in return. The summons arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly into a manila envelope left between the screen door and the frame. No knock, no bell. Willow found it first, assuming it was another reply from zoning or routine delivery, but when she opened it, the chill hit her instantly. It wasn't a reply. It was a lawsuit. Karen Whitmore, Vs. Matthew, and Willow Harper. Civil complaint. Claiming willful trespass, intentional harassment, and unlawful interference with property use. It read like theater. Pages of passive-aggressive legal phrasing twisted into formal accusations. The trespass allegedly occurred when Matt physically obstructed Karen's hired contractors by standing threateningly near the trench as they worked. The harassment charge referenced Willow's pattern of visual surveillance, her presence on the balcony at various hours, and her so-called efforts to document private domestic activity under the guise of property protection. The final charge, the interference, claimed that the Harpers had maliciously obstructed efforts to maintain the historically respected property boundary, and sought damages not only for supposed stress and disruption, but for emotional impact on visiting minors, a reference to Karen's grandchildren. Willow sat down at the table and reread the document 3 times, each time slower, each time more aware of the cold seeping into her spine. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a warning. This was war by paperwork. And it had begun. Matt called the lawyer within 5 minutes. He forwarded the scanned documents and waited in silence as their counsel reviewed the text. The reply came in under 10 minutes. Baseless. Tactically frivolous. But it will slow things down. The lawsuit was a counter-move, timed precisely to intersect with their motion for removal. Their attorney explained the play. Karen's suit would create procedural traffic. It would delay the injunction. It would force the court to address both claims as entangled issues. And, worst of all, it would make the Harpers look like aggressors unless they responded carefully. "She's not trying to win damages," the lawyer said. "She's trying to reposition the narrative, reframe the lines, not just physical, but legal." That night, Willow didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, the lights dimmed low, reviewing every note, every map, every image she'd cataloged. Not to feel vindicated, she already knew the truth, but to remind herself that they hadn't crossed any lines, that they'd responded to aggression with law, not emotion. But now the narrative was no longer theirs alone. Karen had introduced courts, language, precedent. It changed the shape of the battlefield. Over the next several days, the effects became more tangible. Their motion for fence removal was delayed. A hearing was postponed, citing a pending counterclaim. The zoning officer, previously engaged and responsive, now issued a statement saying that active litigation between private parties may limit enforcement procedures pending adjudication. The process had frozen, and Karen knew it. She moved more boldly now, installing a second trellis near the far end of the fence, hanging heavy metal wind ornaments that clanged like dull bells in the night wind. The lights from her garage were replaced with motion-activated strobes, positioned just low enough to avoid ordinance violations, but high enough to disorient anyone crossing through the yard. When Matt complained, the city replied that light pollution was unenforceable unless it posed a documented medical hazard. Willow scheduled an eye exam just to have documentation. It was absurd, it was exhausting, but it was the game now. Then came the noise. Karen began playing classical music outdoors, not blaring, not loud enough to qualify as a nuisance, but just constant. Hours of cello concertos drifting through the slats of the fence like polite threats. Sometimes it was piano sonatas, soft and meticulous, sometimes string quartets. Always tasteful, never offensive, but relentless. One morning, Matt walked outside and saw a portable speaker mounted directly opposite the greenhouse. He didn't touch it. He didn't take a photo. He simply stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of Debussy weaving itself into the soil he had turned with his own hands. When he turned back toward the house, Karen was watching from her porch. She lifted her teacup. Again. Always that small, knowing gesture, as if acknowledging not just her own audacity, but their helplessness. But they weren't helpless. The Harpers had waited long enough. The law moved slowly, yes, but that didn't mean they had to be passive. Their lawyer filed a motion to dismiss Karen's suit for lack of foundation. He filed a parallel complaint citing retaliatory litigation tactics, attaching the timeline of events and correspondence to demonstrate Karen's clear pattern of aggression masked by procedural camouflage. He filed a third motion requesting emergency access to their blocked tool shed, citing safety and property maintenance. It would take days, possibly weeks, but it was movement, measured, precise, unrelenting. Meanwhile, Matt began preparing the other side of the yard. If the east was frozen by conflict, the west would become their focus. He cleared brush, regraded the slope, and laid the foundation for a new patio space. Not because they needed it, because they refused to let Karen dictate what they could build or where they could breathe. Willow planted new rows of lavender and rosemary along the north fence, and in the evenings she walked the yard not with a phone, not with a clipboard, but with a book and a folding chair. She sat in the open, visible, unbothered, reclaiming the space not through confrontation, but through presence. Karen watched, of course. She always watched. But now, when she waved, Willow didn't look up. Still, the pressure mounted. One evening, they returned from a short trip to the market to find a notice pinned to their front door. It was from Animal Control. A complaint had been filed about their dog barking aggressively at children and creating an unsafe environment. They had no children on the property. Their dog had not barked once that day, but the notice meant an officer would be assigned to review, another thread in the web. Their lawyer handled it, of course, filed a response, attached video footage. But the point wasn't the outcome. It was the distraction, the erosion. 1,000 paper cuts. That weekend, things escalated again. Matt woke at 3 a.m. to a metallic clatter. He went to the window, scanned the yard, and saw nothing. But in the morning, he found that someone had thrown roofing nails along the footpath leading from the side gate to the greenhouse. Not a random scattering, a line, a warning. Willow bagged them, labeled the date, and added them to the evidence folder. They filed a report. No fingerprints, no cameras, nothing actionable. Just another shadow in a series of calculated provocations. By Monday, their lawyer secured an emergency hearing. The judge reviewed the documents, read both motions, and issued a temporary injunction. No structural additions, no lighting changes, no obstruction of access to any leased structure. Karen was served that evening. She said nothing, but the speaker was gone by morning. It felt like a shift. Not a victory, but a pause. A moment of equilibrium. But the Harpers knew better than to believe it would last. The court date loomed. The fence remained. And the line, though legally reaffirmed, had already become more than wood and coordinates. It was a statement, a scar, a permanent reminder that once crossed, some boundaries could never truly be restored without consequence. The courtroom was colder than Willow expected, not in temperature, but in mood. Everything about it, the gray carpeting, the heavy wooden tables, the dim hum of overhead lights, seemed engineered to strip emotion from the space. It wasn't justice they walked into that morning. It was administration, process, procedure. And for the first time since this began, Willow realized just how far they'd been pulled from their home and into a machine that didn't care who started what, who had been polite, who had stayed silent longer, or who had built first. The court wanted facts, documents, proof. The rest, the tension, the hostility, the encroachment that grew inch by inch, had to be made legible on paper, or it might as well have never happened. Matt sat beside her, hands clasped, eyes forward, his silence deeper than anything he'd shown before. They weren't here to argue. They were here to endure. Karen sat across from them, dressed in soft beige and a navy scarf, her demeanor the picture of understated offense. She smiled twice. Once when she caught Willow's eye, and once when she adjusted her notepad like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. The judge entered at 10:04 a.m., and within minutes the tempo of everything shifted. Their lawyer presented first, walking through the timeline, the official documents, the municipal plat, the lease agreement, the zoning officer's inspection, the photographic evidence of encroachment, the obstruction of shed access, the illegally installed fence, the retaliatory noise harassment, the lights, the signage, and the accumulated pattern of behavior that transformed what might have been a petty property line dispute into an engineered erosion of legal rights. He was calm, thorough, never dramatic, and never indulged in emotional language. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Karen's attorney responded with a practiced, fluid tone, framing the entire conflict as a misunderstanding exacerbated by the Harpers' unwillingness to engage in open, neighborly discussion. He invoked the term boundary ambiguity, referenced decades-old oral traditions about the line's location, suggested the fence was installed in good faith, based on Karen's understanding of her property's extent, and claimed the solar lights and planters were ornamental, not structural. He did not deny the fence crossed the line. He argued that Karen had no malicious intent and that the removal of said fence would impose an undue emotional and financial burden. The judge listened without expression. Then came the questioning. The judge asked Matt whether he or Willow had ever received written permission from Karen to alter the boundary. Matt replied that they had not, and that they had never attempted to alter the boundary, only to protect the one legally defined. Willow was asked if she had ever verbally threatened Karen or her workers. She said no. She was then asked about the documentation. She confirmed every photo, every timestamp, every submitted notice. Karen was asked whether she had received the cease and desist letter. She said yes. She was asked whether she continued construction after receiving it. She admitted she had. That was the moment the tone changed. The judge leaned forward, took off his glasses, and asked Karen one final question. "Were you aware that the fence you constructed obstructed access to structures under your neighbor's leasehold?" Karen paused, the first true pause of the day. Then said, "I was advised that the fence followed the original spirit of the property's design." The judge didn't respond. He simply looked down, made a note, and called for a 10-minute recess. Outside the courtroom, Willow leaned against the wall, hands folded tightly, watching as Karen stood nearby sipping water like she was waiting for a bus. Matt didn't speak. Their lawyer didn't speculate. They just waited. When court resumed, the judge read his decision aloud. It was not dramatic. It was direct. He ruled that the fence, having been built without proper permitting, across a confirmed legal boundary, in violation of a zoning notice, and in deliberate disregard of written warnings, must be removed in full within 21 days. He authorized access to the blocked shed effective immediately, and prohibited Karen from installing any structure or lighting within 5 feet of the property line for the duration of the lease. Additionally, he stated that the court would entertain motions for damages pending review, but deferred judgment on the harassment claim, calling it insufficiently evidenced at this time. It was a partial victory, but a clear one. Karen didn't react. She gathered her papers calmly, stood, and walked out without making eye contact. Willow and Matt sat still, absorbing the words not with celebration, but with the grim finality of people who knew that while a wall could be torn down, resentment wasn't so easily dismantled. When they returned home, the yard was quiet. The wind had dropped. The fence stood exactly as it had before, but now it was a countdown. Matt didn't speak for most of the evening. He simply gathered his tools, cleaned the shed's lock, and reorganized the work table. He didn't say it, but Willow knew he was preparing for what came next, watching the wall come down, one board at a time, and deciding what they would build in its place. The removal began the following Tuesday. Karen didn't hire professionals. She brought out 2 teenagers, likely relatives who worked slowly, sullenly, one board at a time. The posts proved stubborn. The concrete didn't give easily. It took days. During that time, Karen didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She didn't apologize. She simply remained visible, always at the periphery, always watching. Willow and Matt kept their distance, watching from inside, windows shut. When the last post was pulled, the trench remained, a long scar of disrupted earth slicing across their property. Matt refilled it himself, tamped it down, reseeded the grass. He worked in silence. Willow didn't offer help. She knew he needed to do this alone. They received the formal compliance confirmation from the zoning office 2 days later. The fence had been removed, the line restored, the structure gone, but the echo remained. It wasn't just about land. It was about ownership of space, of peace, of breath. And while the earth might heal, the Harpers would never quite see that stretch of yard the same way again. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet that had greeted them that first spring morning when they stepped onto the dewy grass and dreamed of lavender rows and hand-built trellises. It was a denser quiet now, heavier, as if the soil itself remembered what had happened and wasn't sure whether to relax just yet. The trench was gone, filled and leveled, but the grass hadn't grown back evenly, and the faint outline of where the fence once stood remained like a shadow across the earth. Willow stood at the edge of the eastern side, just past the greenhouse, watching the wind move through the rosemary as if it were testing the air for signs of hostility. Karen hadn't spoken to them since the ruling. She hadn't made eye contact. She no longer waved. Her porch, once a stage from which she watched and performed, had grown oddly vacant. The chairs were there, but unused. The wind chimes were gone. The lights remained, but they didn't flicker on anymore. either out of compliance or neglect. For a few days, Willow thought she might hear one last jab, one final attempt at rewriting the story in her favor. But Karen said nothing. Silence had replaced confrontation, and while it offered relief, it also carried a chill of unfinished things. Matt, for his part, returned to building. Not aggressively, not with vengeance or theatricality, but with quiet intent. He focused on the western edge of the yard, installing the pergola he'd designed months ago, but postponed when the conflict swallowed all their energy. He worked steadily, one beam at a time, grounding each post with the kind of focus that came from someone reclaiming not just land, but agency. He never once looked toward Karen's house. He didn't have to. Everything he did now was for them, not in defiance, but in assertion. This was their space. This was their breath. They decided not to plant along the eastern line that year. Willow said it felt too raw. Instead, they laid down a layer of mulch and left the soil to rest, allowing it to heal without pressure or purpose. The shed was fully accessible again, and inside, Matt reorganized every tool, relabeled every shelf, and oiled the hinges until the door swung smooth as water. Willow returned to her seed catalogs, but with more caution, more deliberation. She no longer planned a season in advance. She moved week by week, letting the garden teach her when it was ready. There was peace again, but it was a peace born of labor, of fatigue, of hard-won defense. Not the easy kind that comes from silence, but the real kind that grows from boundaries drawn and held. They still received mail from the court, closing documents, notices of compliance, an option to pursue damages if they chose. They didn't. The lawyer said they had grounds, strong ones. They could win. But Willow shook her head and said, "We've already taken back what matters." The money would be secondary, and the fight would only open wounds that were finally beginning to seal. Matt agreed. Sometimes justice isn't about winning more. It's about ending it right. One afternoon in late summer, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a single smooth stone, white quartz, polished and cool to the touch. There was no note, no signature. But Willow knew immediately. It matched the markers from the original Eastern line.